The dust hadn't even settled when Sheriff Alden found Caleb Rourke standing alone in the dying light, coat torn, breath steady, eyes carrying the weight of a man who'd run out of every option but truth. A trail of bodies lay behind him, none his doing, all his burden. And when the sheriff demanded to know why Caleb didn't flee like the others, the cowboy just lifted his empty holster, voice low and trembling with something deeper than fear. "I ain't running, Sheriff. I'm just out of bullets." Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The dust still hovers like a held breath when Sheriff Alden found Caleb Rourke standing alone in the dying light, coat torn at the shoulder, hat brim shading eyes that had learned to measure guilt by the length of a man's silence. Caleb did not fall to his knees, did not beg. He simply stood where the last fight had slowed and let the world decide what to do with him. Bodies lay like torn pages along the boardwalk, each one a sentence cut short. The town itself felt small and raw, as if it were an old wound someone had finally opened to see what the infection looked like. Alden walked the line between law and memory, boots thudding soft on packed dirt. And when he stopped before Caleb, the sheriff could see the hunted and the humane braided in that man's face. "Why'd you stay?" Alden asked, voice low. This was a sheriff who knew the calculus of running and the cost of staying. Caleb's answer came without flourish, almost a fact. "I ain't running, Sheriff. I'm just out of bullets." The word should have been a surrender, but there was something in them like a promise. Alden felt the question ripple. Why would a man stand in the open when escape was a horse and a prayer away? Caleb's hands were cut and blackened. His left cheek carried a fresh bruise. He lifted his chin and began to tell it from the beginning, the way a man with nothing left to hide tells the truth. He rode into Silent Gulch that morning because the road had nowhere else to take him. Because there are some towns whose silence calls to a man who used to answer cries for help. He spoke of wives who watched through slats, of children who learned fear like scripture, and of an old man at the edge of the saloon who hissed, like a thing with a secret, that they should leave before the sky bled red. Alden listened more than he spoke. The sheriff's face was a ledger of things once done and mistakes still warm. Caleb admitted he could have left. Every thread of sense said run. But there was a girl who gave him a tarnished token on a plea that sounded like a command. He told Alden how the outlaw Donner had come to own pieces of the town with threats and stolen cattle, how men folded like cheap paper under the weight of menace, how one family refused and paid for it with blood. In the telling, Caleb's language was spare. He did not dramatize. His guilt unspooled in small, honest details. A child's glove he found in the dust, the single teacup on a table still warm from a hand that would not return, the way the sunset in that valley looked like a wound the world could not stitch. He said he stayed because leaving felt like lying to a child who believed someone would stand when it mattered. Alden felt the shape of that answer settle between them. There are codes not written on paper, loyalties older than law. The sheriff's suspicion softened into something like recognition. He remembered faces from his own past, men who had stayed and men who had fled, and he understood that emptiness can be an answer too. The sound of a revolver clicking empty is a kind of confession, and a man who shows you his emptiness is sometimes the truest kind of witness. As Caleb spoke, the sun slid lower, and for a long moment the only sounds were the wind and the faint creak of a loose shutter. At the end he looked at Alden and did not ask for mercy. He simply wanted the story told straight. Alden nodded once, a small emotion that felt like a verdict, and for the first time since he rode into Silent Gulch he allowed himself to believe that a town might breathe again. If men could learn what to carry and what to leave behind. The morning Caleb rode into Silent Gulch felt wrong, like a wound the world had chosen to ignore, a hush that had teeth. He rode under a sky the color of old paper, the sun a dim coin that did not warm the townssphere. Shutters were closed as if the houses were holding their breath. A tapestry of empty porches and hanging shirts told of lives folded in on themselves. He eased his horse down the main street and the only sounds were hoofbeats on dirt and a loose shutter creaking with small, private griefs. Children peered through cracks in curtains, eyes wide and quick, learning the grammar of silence from grown ones who lowered voices as though lowering a gun. Mothers clutched sleeves and counted blessings as if counting might add another one. An old man on the corner spat into the dust and hissed a warning that passed like a wind-blown rumor. "Go back," he said. "Go back before the sky bleeds red." Caleb felt the warning in his bones and rode toward it anyway, because there are hands in the world that cannot close when someone else reaches for them. He dismounted in front of the saloon and tied his horse slow and careful, watching the slats of wood where laughter used to leak through now hold nothing but shadow. He saw the imprint of a child's boot on the stoop and a tiny glove tucked under a wagon wheel, small proofs that people had been here and then had to retreat from something meaner than rust or neglect. The barber's chair sat empty and polished, a single comb lying like a forgotten weapon, a teacup on a windowsill dried with the ghost of steam. A boy's kite hung tangled in a lichen-steeped tree as if the air itself had given up playing. There were tracks leading out of town that ended in the wide openness of the plains, places where people ran and ran until the horizon blurred and their courage thinned like old canvas. Caleb walked the plank of cedar that served as the town's boardwalk and listened for the kind of noises that tell you a place is alive. A whistle, a laugh, the clink of a coin. But the sound was not in Silent Gulch. The town had learned to soothe its noises shut. He moved like a man who tried to be invisible but couldn't help listening. Inside the saloon, a child sobbed once, soft and sharp, and then the sobbing stopped as if someone had put a hand over the town's mouth. At the edge of the saloon door, a woman handed him a small, battered tin with coffee still staining its rim. She did not meet his eyes. She only said, "They take what they want. Don't be keen to be brave where there's no need." Caleb felt the plea like an arrow. Not for praise or fear, but for mercy the town could no longer afford to buy. He learned the name that stitched fear into the town. Donner, J. Stoner, the man who used to raise calves and sing church hymns and then, after some long grief, learned to raise men who took without asking. Stories came out in soft pieces, how Donner and his boys collected debts with knuckled fists, how they took cattle and coin, how families who tried to stand were taught the price of stubbornness with broken windows and worse. Caleb listened and understood the arithmetic, how a town could be bled slow by threats and how courage grows thin when everyone is counting what they will lose next. He moved through Silent Gulch like a question that refused to be ignored, asking for small human things back: a bowl of porridge, a child's drawing, a name to remember, an answer to whether someone would stand when the night came. By the time he remounted to leave the town, the little girl with the tarnished badge had slipped a word into his palm: "Don't leave us when the sky turns. Stay if you can." Caleb did not promise. He only held the badge for a long, private second and rode on, the town's hush riding with him, heavy as a second saddle. Caleb walked the main street with a careful, steady tread, noting the spare proofs that life had receded, the shuttered windows, the empty porches, a child's ribbon caught on a nail like a small, stubborn flag, and he listened for ordinary noises that mark a town as alive and found none. No laughter, no hammer, only the low creak of a loose sign and the whisper of wind through empty rafters. An old man sat on a sagging bench outside the post office, face mapped with lines that read like letters of loss, and when Caleb slowed, the man spat into the dust and hissed, "Turn back," this sound more plea than command. Caleb paused, because the world teaches you sometimes to heed old men, but he also remembered that mercy sometimes asks you to stay where reason says flee. He could not saddle his conscience and ride off on a town's silence felt like a supplication. The old man's voice trembled as if speaking louder might summon whatever terror the town had been keeping at bay. Yet he leaned forward and breathed the warning that everyone seemed to be carrying in pockets and prayers: "They come when the sky bleeds red." The phrase landed in Caleb's chest with the weight of both superstition and a history he'd seen before, the way fear can learn a language of its own so people can live with it. Eyes peered through curtains like birds watching a hawk. A woman pressed a tin cup of coffee into his hand and would not meet his face when she said, "They're taking what they want, one by one." Caleb walked the street counting small facts: an overturned chair by a door, a child's shoe half buried in dust, a fresh scrape on a post where someone had been shoved, and the arithmetic of dread added up. When men collect by force, neighborhoods learn to fold. He found the saloon dark, the bar wiped neat yet gathering dust, and in its shadow a little girl sat behind an overturned crate, her hands fidgeting with the tarnished badge she pressed into Caleb's palm like an offering. Her whisper was thin and steady, Someone has to stay. He felt that whisper as a physical weight, heavier than the ridge of his saddle, and it rooted him to the spot. Memory tugged, a man who had once chosen the easier road and learned its cost. But memory did not make him blind to prudence. It made him measure the cost of leaving against the cost of standing. People spoke in fragments, stories of Jay Stoner and his boys, of debts collected with fists and cattle taken in the quiet hours, of families who tried to hold and were taught their stubbornness's price. The old man's warning made the danger feel immediate, painted the coming light in tones of blood and dusk, yet it did not change the town's need for someone to keep their feet when others folded. Before he remounted, the old man spat again and, perhaps out of relief to say it aloud, added, "When the sky bleeds red, it's not just sunset, they kill under that light." Caleb tied his horse slow and steady, held the small bat in his palm as if testing its weight, and looked out along the rim of the valley where the day seemed to redden later than elsewhere. He did not promise to stay. He only set his jaw and listened to the town's small, urgent hopes as if they were orders. Caleb told the sheriff that the truth of Silent Gulch came to him not all at once, but in fragments, soft as dust, sharp as broken glass, each detail whispered by someone too afraid to speak the whole story aloud. And it began with a name spoken like a curse scraped across stone: Jay Stoner. Caleb had heard the name before on distant trails, a rancher once known for helping neighbors mend fences and sharing water in dry seasons, a man with a wife who braided flowers into her hair and a son who rode beside him laughing, until the fire took them both and something inside Donna twisted into a shape that no longer answered to decency. The town spoke of them the way people speak of winter storms, inevitable, merciless, and already on the horizon. Donner and his gang rode through every few weeks, not at full gallop but with the slow confidence of men who knew fear was a more efficient tool than bullets. They demanded cattle, coin, food, and worse, made fathers kneel in dirt just to teach a lesson about obedience. Caleb listened as the storekeeper, hands trembling hard enough to rattle tins on the shelf, explained how Donner's men marked houses with red chalk, paid, unpaid, next, and how the ones who resisted were given a choice: surrender a hostage or face a reckoning that left families burying more than they could afford to lose. This time Donner wanted the daughter of a rancher who had once worked for him, a girl barely old enough to braid her own hair. The townsfolk had refused. The refusal came with the weight of night pressing in like a closing fist. Caleb walked the length of the town listening to these stories, feeling them stack in his chest like layers of old guilt, and though his body was weary from the trail and his mind begged for rest, he felt the truth carve its path clean. As long as Donner ruled through fear, Silent Gulch had no dawn coming. Mothers told him they'd boarded up windows before the gang arrived. Fathers said they'd hide in cellars because fighting meant leaving widows behind, and though none said it aloud, Caleb could feel their shame. They had survived by shutting their eyes while others fled. The little girl from the saloon, Lena, pressed the tarnished badge into his palm again. This time with tears she tried to hold back, whispering that her father once promised good men still existed. Caleb felt that promise coil around him like a binding rope, old, frayed, but strong enough to keep him from walking away. He walked outside, letting the cold wind carry grit against his skin, and he stared down the road where Donna would come, the horizon wide and indifferent, the land waiting to see who would stand and who would fold. A part of him wanted to leave. God knew he had done enough fighting to last several lives, but the faces of Silent Gulch, hollowed by fear and shame, held him still. He thought of his own past, of times he turned away too late, and the memory tasted like iron in his mouth. So when the mayor, voice shaking like a branch in winter, told him they had no one left to stand against Donner, Caleb simply nodded and said he'd take the place meant for the hostage. The town fell silent at his words, the kind of silence that comes when people see something they've forgotten existed, a man choosing to stand without being asked. He felt the weight of it settle over him, not pride, not righteousness, just an old, tired resolve. And as Caleb finished recounting this to Sheriff Alden, the sheriff understood why the bodies lay where they had fallen and why Caleb had not run even when the last bullet left his gun. Sheriff Alden felt something twist in his chest the moment Caleb spoke Jay Stoner's name, a name Alden had not let pass his lips in years, and a name that carried the dust of old memories and the weight of a man he once called friend. And as Caleb continued recounting the story, Alden's breath grew tight because he could still picture Jace as he had been before grief hollered him out, a broad-shouldered rancher with a sunburned smile, a man who used to help neighbors mend fences after storms and who brought extra feed to widows in lean winters, a man whose wife, Lila, braided pieces of wild sage into her hair and whose little boy toddled around the stockyard with a wooden horse tied to his belt. Alden had watched Jace lose them both in a house fire that crackled through dry timber faster than any man could run. He remembered holding Jace back while he screamed their names into a night hot with smoke, and Alden had seen that moment carve the world into a before and after. Before Jace's honor belonged to the land, and after he belonged to the darkness. As Caleb spoke, Alden felt those memories rise like ghosts around him. He remembered the day Jace stopped meeting Alden's eyes, the day he stopped coming to church, the day he sold the last of his cattle and started riding with men who whispered about easy money and hard vengeance. Alden had hoped distance would soften Jace's bitterness, but instead the man grew sharper, colder, like grief had become the only compass he knew how to follow. Listening to Caleb, the sheriff saw the path Jace had walked etched in the dust between them, and he saw something even more unsettling. He saw the same moral fracture flickering beneath Caleb's steady tone. Caleb spoke like a man used to measuring his actions against the ghosts he carried, a man standing at the same crossroads where Jace once stood, justice in one direction, survival in the other, with a thin, dangerous rail between them. Alden realized Caleb's decision to stand in Silent Gulch had not come from fearlessness but from the fear of becoming something worse, a man who looks away when someone else bleeds. The sheriff found himself studying Caleb's face under the dimming sky, noting the bruises, the dirt, the exhaustion, but also the quiet flame of someone who chose a harder road because he couldn't live with the easier one. For a moment Alden wondered if he was listening to the story of a man trying to redeem old sins or prevent new ones, and the thought made his throat tighten. He remembered the last time he spoke to Jace, how Jace had whispered, almost pleading, "Alden, men break in different ways, don't judge how I mend." Now Alden looked at Caleb and felt the eerie echo of that brokenness, as if both men, Jace in his descent, Caleb in his struggle, stood on the two ends of the same tragedy. The sheriff stepped closer, boots stirring the dust between them, and the bodies scattered nearby seemed suddenly like punctuation in a sentence written by fate, drawing sharp lines between choices and consequences. He felt no triumph in knowing Caleb had survived the confrontation with Donner's gang, only a hollow ache that whispered of the life Jace could have lived if someone had stood beside him before darkness took root. Alden's jaw tightened, his breath steady but heavy, and he understood, truly understood, why Caleb had stayed, why he hadn't run, why he had let his bullocks run dry rather than abandon a town that had no one else left to believe in. In Caleb Rourke, Alden saw not a hero or an outlaw, but a man still fighting to choose the part of himself worth saving. And the sheriff knew that it was a battle Jace Donner had lost long ago. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. Alright then, let's get back on the trail. Caleb found Lena in the saloon where light came through the slats and thin, ashamed lines, where the air tasted faintly of spilled whiskey and old wood. She was a small thing wrapped in a too large coat, knees drawn to her chest behind overturned chairs like a bird that had learned to hide from storms. And when he crouched, she did not flinch, only stared with eyes so big they seemed to hold the whole town's fear, and in her fist she clutched a tarnished badge, the metal dulled by grime and the rubbing of many nervous palms, which she pressed into his hand as if that small circle of brass could anchor a promise. Her voice was a reed. "Please don't go," she said, not a child's whimper but a demand born of exhausted hope. And the words hit him with the force of someone handing over their last clean thing and asking you to keep it from the rain. He saw her father in the shape of her shoulders and the set of her jaw. Stories moves through the saloon in low currents, the man who refused Donner's will, who stood in a doorway and said a thing that would not be said again, who kept his stubbornness like a lamp and lost everything to the dark. Caleb felt the name of that stubbornness like a hand around his own throat. How often have men like him promised they would not be cowards, and then found themselves cowards when the moment came? Lena did not know those histories. She knew only that a promise had been made to her at the cost of a life. And now she offered that promise to Caleb with the seriousness of someone who has seen what adults can trade away. He could have left. The road was long and he was tired, the kind of tired that aches in the joints and in the decisions. But the badge in his palm was heavier than metal. It carried the ghost of a father's laugh, the echo of a small boy's boat beside a cattle trough, the stubborn proof that someone had once been a lawman or a man who believed in law, and now that token needed a carrier. Lena spoke again. Her words clipped. "They'll take us if no one stays." The sentence was simple, small as a nut, and enormous as a debt. Caleb looked at her and thought of all the towns he'd passed where people had learned to count losses to get by. There is a shape to a life made only of losses, flat, hollow, and he did not want that carved into a child. He felt, too, the shame of men who survived by fleeing. He had seen their faces fold into resignation, and he had felt in himself the old hunger to run towards some horizon that would make sense of the noise in his chest. But Lena's badge made sense of nothing and everything at once, an emblem of faith no one else could carry. He remembered the way her father had refused and how that refusal had been met with the clean, practiced cruelty of Donner's boys, how they taught obedience with an economy of terror. The image of a father kneeling in the dust, of a little girl watching with cheeks that had not yet hardened into the map of adult sorrow, stayed in Caleb's mind like a splinter he could not pull. He could tell Sheriff Alden about tactics, about how to set an ambush or where to place men. But the thing that made him stay was not strategy. It was the face of a child when she believes there is at least one person who will not turn away. He thought of how bravery sometimes looks less like triumph and more like a decision to hold a space for someone who cannot hold it themselves. So he sat with Lena until the light thinned and the saloon's shadow swallowed the corners, and he kept the band in his hand as if it were a living thing. He promised nothing in words, he never did, but he told her a truth that felt like a promise. "I'll be here when it comes." The sentence hung between them like a tether. Lena exhaled, small and immediate, and for a second the saloon seemed less like a tomb and more like a place that had room for a small, stubborn hope. Caleb left then, walking the boardwalk slow so the weight of his boots matched the weight of the choice, and somewhere behind him a child's voice sang a little to itself, an old tune learned from somebody who had once believed the world could be better. The sound made a hollow in his chest where a resolve could settle, and later, when bullets began to count down like a cruel metronome, that badge would be a bright point, a reason to aim not at survival alone but at the promise of a life kept for someone who could not keep it for herself. Caleb moved through Silent Gulch like a man filling a role he had long tried to leave behind, hands busy with planks and nails, voice low when he needed to be heard, and every action felt both necessary and painful as if he were stitching a wound that refused to stay closed. He helped mothers and old men drag drunks into cellars, taught children how to breathe slow and shallow so their sobs wouldn't give away hiding places, and set small, desperate traps, broken boards set to snag a boot, jars of nails hidden to sing a warning when horses stamped past, while the town's shadows grew long and the horizon waited like a held breath. The boardwalk became a clinic of hurried, practical hope, doors braced with crossbeams, shutters bolted with padlocks smashed with hammer blows, rugs folded over upstairs windows to muffle light. Caleb's fingers remembered the work of a man who had once repaired more than fences. They found a rhythm in hammer strikes that steadied him even as his heart kept time with a different, older drum, one that counted names and faces failed before. He did not fashion himself for glory. He fashioned small mercies, piles of dry biscuits tied in cloth for those who would need food under floorboards, a squat of coffee warmed over a small lantern for an old woman with arthritic hands, a soft blanket tucked around a boy who stared at the gap beneath the door as if the darkness might crawl through it. Each act was a small rebellion against the idea that fear could be domesticated by silence. At night he walked the length of the street whispering instructions, voice scarcely above a wind. "Move the kids 2 houses left. They'll hear the hoofbeats sooner there. Hide the lantern behind the stair. It'll give us a signal if they split up." His words were not commands so much as a ledger of care passed from one hand to another. The revolver at his hip was a familiar weight and an old, unwanted friend. He checked it like a man checking teeth in a mouth full of regrets, counting cartridges like beads on a rosary until each click felt like confession. The bullets were few, and each one felt, absurdly, like a promise he could not keep. He ran his thumb along the hammer and tasted the metallic memory of past shots, the echo of fates decided too quickly. His internal voice argued, soft and relentless, about who he once was, a man who'd shot first to live, who'd learned later that survival carved hollows in the soul. That memory lived in him like a shadow that lengthened as the sun fell. He felt the pull between the older instinct to run and the newer rule he'd tried to live by. Do the hard thing when the easy thing is to turn away. When he looked at the faces pressed to windows, he saw a map of choices. A woman whose eyes had had enough nights to harden into armor, but still trembled when she folded a child's blanket. An old blacksmith who had once taught him to fit a shoe and now bent to hide a shovel like it was a sin. Kids who believed the world would hand them morning whether man stood for it or not. He thought of Lena clutching her father's tarnished badge, that heavy little coin of faith, and it was as if it had become a compass in his palm, pointing toward a direction he could no longer refuse. Preparing the street became less about tactics and more about moral geography, choosing which lives to put between the line of fire and which to hold back so the town could survive with shame instead of with ruin. When the dusk came and the first stars inked the sky, Caleb sat briefly on the steps of the saloon. The wood cooled under his palms, and for a moment the past rose like a tide. Faces of men he'd killed, the squeal of wagon wheels on a night he still dreamed of, the bitter applause of a life made by gunfire. He let the memories wash through him without trying to swim against them. Instead, he folded them into his work, let the ache of the past sharpen his hands so they could be steadier now. Others moved around him, men who'd never held a gun and yet found courage in shoveling earth over a cellar entrance, women who had learned to make do into defense, children who practiced silence until it became skill. Caleb's breath became the metronome for the town's thin hope, every exhale a small prayer that the barricades would hold, that bullets would miss, that a man with a twisted grief named Donner might find the faintest scrap of decency and not come at all. He tightened a nail, checked the revolver's chamber for the 100th time, and felt the hourglass in his gut where bullets were grains, each one falling closer to the thin line between keeping faith and being left with regret. The sun went down like it had someplace urgent to be, sliding behind the mountains until the whole horizon blazed the color of fresh blood, and Silent Gulch held its breath as if the world itself had snapped a thread. The old man's warning, "They come when the sky bleeds red," echoed in Caleb's mind, not as superstition now but as a grim, punctual truth. A low tremor rolled over the ground, subtle at first, like the earth remembering an old grief, and then it deepened into the drumbeat of hooves pounding closer, measured, merciless, unhurried, announcing Donner's gang long before they became shapes carved into the dying light. Dust lifted behind them in a long, snarling ribbon, turning the air thick and metallic, and their silhouettes rose out of the red horizon like specters pulled from a fever dream. Wide-brimmed hats, rifles slung easy, the swagger of men who believed fear was a weapon sharper than any blade. Caleb stepped into the center of the street, shoulders square, soles pressing into dust that felt almost warm, as if the sun had left some last ember for him to stand on. Every house was dark behind him, windows shuttered, families crouched in basements with breath held tight enough to ache. He could almost feel the tremor of their prayers brushing the back of his neck. His heart hammered hard once, twice, then settled into a slow, deliberate rhythm, steadying not because he lacked fear, but because fear had become a thing he carried carefully, like a lantern that lit only the path he could not turn from. His hand hovered near his holster, thumb brushing the worn leather, the revolver inside feeling lighter than it ever had. Every bullet he had left was a grain in an hourglass that had nearly run dry, but he would not waste even a heartbeat thinking about the end when the beginning of the fight had only just taken shape. Donner's men ranged about 30 yards out, forming a jagged line, their horses stamping, snorting clouds into the cooling air. The gang leader's silhouette stood at the center, larger than memory, broader than rumor, and for a moment the red sky behind him seemed to bow around his form as if sunset itself deferred to the man he had become. Caleb kept his shoulders loose, jaw tight, breath controlled, inhale slow, exhale slower, matching the pacing of fate as it finally reached the point on the road where it had always been headed. For a heartbeat the world hung still, no wind, no birds, even the dust seemed to hover midair, waiting. Caleb's eyes locked on Donner's shape, and something old and tired rose in his chest. an understanding that some confrontations are not born of choice but of the long, unavoidable lines carved by grief and by guilt. His breath synced with the rhythm he remembered from past standoffs, that long, slow pacing where time itself stretches thin, a quiet before the storm that feels like the world taking one last inhale. The red sky deepened, darker, heavier, until it felt like it might spill onto the street, and the fires of sunset lit the edges of Caleb's coat, turning him into a lone figure framed in flame. Behind him, a shutter creaked. In front of him, Donner's men shifted in their saddles. Caleb planted his boots, spine straightening with a quiet resolve shaped not by pride but by duty, his silhouette a single slash against the glowing street. And as the gang began to spread, readying themselves for the violence they believed they owned, Caleb let his breath slip out slow, steady, final, not the end of fear, but the acceptance of it. Fate had arrived, hoofbeat by hoofbeat, and Caleb Rourke stood alone to meet it beneath the sky bleeding red. The moment Donner's men leaned forward in their saddles, the world snapped from silence into motion so sudden it felt like the sky itself flinched. Caleb saw the first rider's heel dig into a horse's flank, and then the charge came, fast, furious, a blur of pounding hooves and rising dust that swallowed sound and thought until all that remained was instinct sharpened by resolve. He drew his revolver in a single, practiced motion, not with the eagerness of a man hungry for blood but with the solemnity of someone performing a duty no one else had the courage left to shoulder. The first shot cracked through the red haze like a lightning strike, clean, deliberate, and the rider it found toppled sideways, hitting the dirt in a hard, boneless thud that sent a spray of dust into the bleeding sky. Caleb didn't linger on the fall. He pivoted, firing again, the recoil biting into his palm, his breath sinking with each pull of the trigger. He felt no anger, only the heavy calm of responsibility, each shot a word in the grim language he'd hoped never to speak again. Behind shuttered windows, townsfolk watched with their hands clamped over their mouths, eyes wide and desperate. Men who once claimed they'd stand tall shrinking behind curtains, women clutching children to their skirts, the older ones whispering prayers with trembling lips, all witnessing a lone man fight a battle they had surrendered long before this night. Caleb moved with the rhythm of survival and purpose. Step, fire, inhale, pivot, exhale. It was a dance he despised but could not refuse. A second rider pitched forward, his horse screaming as it stumbled, and Caleb felt the countdown begin in his mind, the brutal arithmetic of gunfights. 5 bullets left. Donner's men were shouting now, their voices sharp and slicing through the dust, commands and curses bleeding together as they fanned out, trying to surround him. Caleb felt the ground tremble beneath his boots, the heat of friction rising from the earth where hooves dug divots into hard-packed dirt. He fired again. 4 and another silhouette crumpled, swallowed by dust and chaos. A horse nearly ran him down, the wind of its passing ripping at his coat, but Caleb dropped to one knee and shot upward, the muzzle flashed bright against the reddening sky, dropping the rider in a twist of limbs. 3. Sweat trickled down his spine, not fear sweat, but focus sharpening into something almost painful. The gang regrouped, their faces tight with fury and disbelief. This wasn't how Silent Gulch was supposed to behave. This wasn't the coward script they'd grown used to reading. A bottle rolled across the street. He didn't know who dropped it, didn't have time to care. A scream echoed from a distant window. Caleb rose, breath steady, gun hand unwavering even as the dust cluttered his throat. He shot again, to the slug catching a man midway load, spinning him backward in a spray of dirt and rage. Caleb felt the weight of the remaining bullets like stones in his chest. They were too few, moving too fast toward the empty that waited at the end. Donner's men pressed harder, guns blazing, muzzle flashes stuttering through the dust like fireflies of violence. Caleb ducked behind an overturned wagon, splinters exploding near his cheek as bullets chewed through old wood. He counted the brief pause between volleys and stood again, firing, one the gunshot echoing off the saloon walls as another outlaw fell slack from his saddle. The street shook with panic and fury, the air thick with dust and gunpowder, and still Caleb held his ground, the last bullet sitting in the chamber like a final breath. One left, he told himself, feeling the weight of the entire town pressing against his back, counting on that last round as if it were a prayer. He stepped into the open again, determined, steady, a lone figure carved from resolve beneath the sky still bleeding red. Caleb felt the street closing in on him with every heartbeat, every gunshot, every gasp of dust-filled air as Donner's memory grouped with a fury sharpened by disbelief. They were not used to being challenged, not used to losing men in a town that had long ago surrendered its will, and that shift in their confidence made the night tremble with a new, violent edge. He ducked behind a stack of barrels near the mercantile, splinters flicking off like angry sparks as bullets punched through the wood inches from his ribs. His revolver felt lighter now, almost hollow, the metal warm from overuse, and when he cracked the chamber open to check, the sight of that near-empty wheel struck him with a cold clarity of truth. One bullet, maybe two, if fate had been kind, but it rarely was. He snapped it shut with a precision born not from eagerness but from necessity, from the weight of every life hiding in basements and behind shuttered windows. He inhaled, slow and steady, letting the breath burn through his lungs as if cleansing doubt, but doubt clung tight anyway. His mind flickered to the past, the last gunfight he'd sworn would be the final one. The look in a dying man's eyes that had followed him for years, the vow he'd made to never again let violence be the only language he spoke. And yet here he was, speaking it fluently. Caleb slid to the edge of the barrel stack and rose just enough to spot the muzzle flashes blooming from behind the truck across the street. He fired, clean, reflexive, sending one of Donner's men sprawling back with a howl. One left, the rhythm in his head whispered, a cruel metronome counting down to nothing. He moved again. Rolling across the dirt, his bullets tore into the barrels where he'd been crouched seconds before, dust exploding around him in gritty clouds that stung his eyes and turned every inhale into a rasp. He crouched behind a rain barrel, chest heaving, and the internal war began to gnaw at him. You can't hold them off. You can't save them all. You've done enough. But beneath that whisper rose another, Lena's small hands pressing her father's badge into his palm, the tin's weight heavier than any bullet, the old man's trembling warning, the mothers who placed silent trust in him when they hid their children away. Their fear had not driven him forward, their faith had. He ground his teeth, pushing off the weariness and the ache in his knuckles as he leaned to one side, glimpsing two riders pushing up the left flank. He fired again. The last bullet and one rider toppled with a strangled grunt. The finality of the empty chamber hit him with a hollow click that echoed louder than any gunshot. His stomach tightened, not in fear, but in acceptance. The next moments would be fought without the comfort of distance, without the shield of steel and powder. He ducked, his bullet sparked against the metal of the trough, and he sprinted low toward the saloon's porch, boots slamming against the ground with desperate purpose. His breath tore in his throat, and still he moved, driven by a fire he thought he'd buried years ago, a promise that he would not abandon those who believed he would stand for them. He grabbed hold of the saloon pillar just as another volley shredded the space he'd crossed, wood splintering outward like a burst of angry bees. He knew he couldn't hold out much longer. His muscles burned, his arms shook, his ears rang with the relentless roar of the fight, but endurance had ceased to be a question. He wasn't standing for himself. He wasn't standing for redemption. He was standing because Silent Gulch had placed its last remaining hope on his shoulders, and he refused to be the man who broke under it. Even empty-handed, even empty-chambered, Caleb Rourke held the line, not because he believed he could win, but because the people behind him deserved someone who would try. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like, and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then. Let's get back on the trail. Donner stepped out of the settling dust like a shadow given flesh, the red sky framing him in a cruel halo that made him look larger, older, and somehow more hollow than the stories had warned. Caleb, chest heaving, boots dragging lines through the dirt, felt the world narrow to the width of the street as the outlaw leader dismounted with the slow inevitability of a man who had long ago stopped rushing toward violence because he knew it would always wait for him. Donner didn't speak, not at first, and neither did Caleb, the silence between them thick as the dust the dying hoofs had kicked up, each man studying the other with a recognition that cut deeper than any blade. Two lives split by grief, two hearts shaped by loss, two men walking different paths from the same wound. Donner's eyes flickered, dark and burning, but beneath the fury Caleb saw something fractured, a man cracked straight through the center, held together only by anger because love and hope had abandoned him long ago. Caleb's hand tightened around his revolver out of instinct, though he knew the truth already. When he raised it, the metal felt light, almost mocking, and when he pulled the trigger, the hollow click echoed across the street like a confession, a brittle sound that told the truth. He was out of bullets, out of time, out of anything that could end this from a distance. Donner's lips curled, not quite into a smile, not quite into pity, something darker, as if he'd expected this moment, as if he'd been riding toward this empty click for months, years, maybe forever. Caleb lowered the gun, not in surrender but in understanding, and let it hang at his side, empty as the promises he once made to leave this kind of life behind. The wind pushed a curl of dust between them, and for a brief heartbeat the world felt paused, suspended, every window in Silent Gulch trembling with eyes that dared to hope the fight might end with something other than blood. Donner stepped closer, boots slow, deliberate, every movement carrying the weight of a man who'd lost the right things too early and chosen the wrong things ever since. Caleb saw the memory of a smiling rancher's son in those dark eyes, but it flickered and died as quickly as it came, replaced by a hatred that had replaced grief in Donner's heart. Still neither spoke. Words would have cheapened what stood between them. Pain, regret, the echoing truth that loss does not shape all men the same. Caleb's breath steadied as he let the fear settle into resolve, the same resolve that had put him in front of Silent Gulch's trembling families, the same resolve that had carried him through every bullet fired. He straightened, meeting Donner's gaze without flinching, though sweat traced the dirt on his neck and his ribs throbbed with every inhale. Donner's jaw flexed. He drew a long breath through his nose, nostrils flaring with something like anger and something like recognition, as if he saw in Caleb the man he might have become if fate had handed him a different miracle instead of the fire that took his world away. The silence broke when Donner reached for his holster. The leather scraped slow, inevitable, final, but Caleb didn't move. Couldn't, wouldn't. Running was gone from him now, shed like an old skin the moment Lena placed her father's tarnished badge into his hand. The townsfolk crouched behind shutters, clutching each other as that quiet street became a graveyard waiting to be filled. Caleb met the outlaw's gaze and felt the weight of his own past settle into place, not to crush him, but to root him. If this was where his story ended, then at least it ended standing. The distance between them closed to a handful of paces, the sky bleeding red above. Donner's hand hovered at his hip. Caleb's empty revolver hung loose at his side. And for one heartbeat, long enough to feel the whole world tremble, they simply breathed the same air, burdened by losses neither man knew how to bury. Then Donner's fingers twitched, and fate moved. Caleb didn't wait for Donner to finish the draw. The moment the outlaw's fingers twitched toward his holster, Caleb threw himself forward with the last of his strength, closing the distance in a single desperate lunge that carried all the fear, all the resolve, all the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had no bullets left but still chose to fight. They collided with a sound that split the hush of Silent Gulch, bodies slamming into the dust hard enough to send a choking cloud around them as they tumbled, fists clawing for advantage, knees grinding into earth baked by 100 merciless suns. Donner was stronger, harder, his muscles shaped by grief and fury and years of punishing the world for what it took from him. He rolled Caleb beneath him with a savage shove, fists landing like stones, each blow lighting sparks behind Caleb's eyes, the copper taste of blood rising at the back of his throat. Caleb felt his ribs groan under the weight of Donner's brutality, felt the edges of the world begin to tilt, to pulse, to blur, yet even as his breath stuttered, even as the outlaw's clenched hands sought to break what little fight he had left, Caleb refused to go limp. He shoved upward, fingers digging for leverage in Donner's coat, tasting dust so thick it felt like swallowing dirt from a grave. The sheriff, listening now with a rigid jaw, heard in Caleb's voice the ragged edges of that struggle, the raw sounds of men wrestling not just each other, but every ghost that had ever shaped them. Donner snarled, a guttural, animal sound, and drove Caleb's face into the ground, the grit scraping skin from his cheek. Pain shot through Caleb's skull in a white flash, and for a moment he could feel the tight pull of death waiting in the wings. Donner's hands wrapped around Caleb's throat in a brutal grip, thumbs pressing hard, cutting off air, sight narrowing to a tunnel of crimson and shadow. Caleb clutched his wrists, But Donner's grief-fueled strength was monstrous, a force born of a heart cracked beyond repair. Darkness crept in around the edges of Caleb's vision, the world turning distant, muffled. But somewhere deep, beneath the pain, beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, Lena's voice echoed, small and steady, "Please don't go." That single memory pulled him back from the brink. Caleb mustered what strength remained in him, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for that child clutching her father's tarnished badge. He twisted abruptly, one hand finding a jagged shard of wood from the shattered barrel beside them. Donner raised a fist for the final blow, but Caleb drove the shard upward, not deep, not precise, but enough to shock the outlaw, enough to break the chokehold long enough for Caleb to suck in a desperate, ragged breath. Donner reeled back, rage blazing, and charged again. Caleb used the rage, let it carry the outlaw's weight forward, then pivoted and used his own shoulder as leverage, sending Donner crashing hard onto a pile of broken boards. A sharp crack split the air as wood snapped beneath Donner's body. The outlaw gasped, a choked sound torn from somewhere deep, his hand clutching instinctively at his side where the jagged timber had pierced through flesh and into something vital. Caleb staggered, barely upright, watching as Donner tried to rise, tried to summon that old rage once more, but found only the weakness of a mortal wound. The fight, brutal and breathless, bled out of the outlaw in slow, shallow breaths. Donner's eyes lifted to Caleb's, no longer burning, but lost, tired, a man standing at the edge of the final cliff he'd been riding toward for years. Caleb knelt, chest heaving, dust clinging to sweat-slick skin, the taste of iron and dirt heavy on his tongue. He didn't speak. Donner's lips twitched as if reaching for words he no longer had strength to shape, and then his body slump, the rage that had fueled him slipping away into the waiting quiet of night. Caleb remained there for a moment, fighting for a breath, the pain pulsing through every rib, every muscle, knowing this was the end, not of violence, not of the past, but of one man's long, broken fall. Silent Gulch's nightmare lay dying in the dirt, and Caleb Rourke stayed kneeling beside him, not in triumph, but in the solemn recognition of a life unraveled beyond saving. Caleb pushed himself upright with a groan that felt older than his bones, staggering as the fiery sky dimmed into a bruised purple and Donner's remaining men. Those who could still grip reins and breathe without choking on dust, turned their horses and fled into the darkening plains, their silhouettes shrinking into the horizon like the last ragged threads of a nightmare being pulled away. The retreat wasn't triumphant. It was panicked, frantic, a scramble of men who had believed themselves immortal until a single worn-down cowboy proved otherwise, and their hoofbeats faded with a kind of desperate shame that clung to the cooling air. Caleb wiped blood from his brow, his own, Donner's, he couldn't tell, and forced himself to stand straighter, though every muscle protested with the sharp, splintered ache of a body pushed far beyond its limits. The street around him was a battlefield painted in dust and silence. Bodies lay where they'd fallen, twisted shapes half swallowed by the debris of shattered barrels, broken boards, and the fading remnants of gun smoke. He stared at them with no pride, no satisfaction, only a hollow heaviness settling inside him like cold lead. Violence, he knew, never left clean lines behind. Every man lying in that dirt had once been something more, a son, a brother, a child who laughed, long before the world bent them toward darker paths. As the quiet deepened, the first door creaked open, then another. Faces emerged in the dusk like ghosts waking from a long-held fear, mothers holding trembling children, old men clutching hats to their chests, neighbors who had survived too much and expected a little more. They came slowly, hesitant, as though touching the night might cause it to break again. Caleb watched them step into the street, their eyes wide with disbelief and relief mixing together in fragile threads. He felt their gratitude like a weight rather than a comfort. A woman knelt beside her husband's shop, collapsing into tears not because she'd lost something, but because, for the first time in years, she hadn't. A boy stared at Caleb with eye too big for his small face, and Caleb had to look away, unwilling to let anyone see the exhaustion bleeding through him. Then the saloon door swung open, and Lena ran toward him before anyone could stop her, her small feet pounding the dirt with the urgency of someone who had been holding her breath all night. She collided with him, arms wrapping around his waist. burying her face against the dust and blood smeared across his coat. Caleb froze, startled by the sudden warmth of her hug, by the fierceness of a child who had already lost too much. "Thank you," she whispered, voice small but steady, carrying the sincerity of a prayer pressed into the night. Caleb swallowed hard, feeling something twist deep in his chest, something dangerously close to breaking. He placed a shaking hand on her back, unsure if he was comforting her or if she was the only thing keeping him upright. He didn't deserve her gratitude. He felt that truth like a bruise on the soul. "I just stood where I had to," he murmured, though the words came out rough, uncertain, not meant for her ears. But Lena only held tighter, as though she understood something deeper than his confession. That standing, even broken and empty, had been enough. Behind them, the townspeople began gathering near the saloon steps, forming a loose, trembling circle around Caleb, not with reverence, but with the quiet, stunned acknowledgement of survival. Lanterns flickered to life, casting soft halos around tear-streaked faces, revealing a community emerging from the long shadow of fear. Caleb looked at them, at the fragile hope rekindling in their eyes, and felt the ache of conflicting truths. He had saved them, yes, but the cost was etched across the ground in still bodies and splintered memories. He wondered if the dead deserved more than silence, if their stories should be spoken aloud, even if their choices had led them here. But his thoughts were interrupted by Lena's small hand slipping into his, grounding him in the present moment. The bench she had given him earlier glinted faintly in her other palm. Caleb lowered his head and let the stillness of Silent Gulch wash over him, the pain, the relief, the moral scar settling into place, knowing that healing, for them and for him, would not come easy. Violence had solved the night, but it had solved nothing cleanly. Yet for now, the townspeople were alive. Lena was alive, and that was enough to make him stand, no matter how much his body begged to fall. Sheriff Alden stood in the settling quiet, Caleb's story still echoing in the spaces between gunshots that no longer filled the air, and for a long stretch of heartbeats he didn't speak. He simply walked among the fallen, boots sinking into dust still warm from violence, eyes tracing the bodies with a haunted recognition that felt like being dragged backward through time. Some faces he knew from wanted posters tacked to his office wall, men he had hunted, men he had failed to catch, but others struck far deeper. Former ranch hands he'd once shared coffee with at sunrise, a drifter he'd given a blanket to one cold winter, a boy who used to help stack hay outside the trading post, now twisted in the dirt with the same blank stare Alden had seen too many times before. Each recognition tightened something in his chest, each memory a sharp reminder of how thin the line had always been between the men who stayed decent and the men who broke beneath the world's weight. He paused over Donner's body longest, the lamplight brushing across the outlaw's features, softening them into something unbearably human, no longer a monster carved by rumor, but a man crushed by grief who had let vengeance got him until there was nothing left to salvage. Alden swallowed hard, tasting the old bitterness of failure. He had known Jace Donner before the fire, before the empty years, before the quiet hardening that turned sorrow into cruelty. Looking down now, Alden felt the sting of what-ifs burn behind his ribs. If he had intervened sooner, if he had reached out, if he had not let time and pride widen the gap between them. But the past offered no mercy. The sheriff exhaled, a weary breath that shuddered with the weight of a man who understood that justice, in the West, often wore the same face as regret. When he turned to Caleb, he didn't see a gunslinger thirsting for glory. He saw the toil etched deep in the lines around Caleb's eyes, saw the tremor of exhaustion in his hands, saw the quiet shame of a man who took no pride in the bodies scattered around him. The lamplight caught the smear of blood on Caleb's cheek, the torn fabric of his sleeve, the slump in his posture that spoke of pain deeper than bruises, pain of being forced into the very violence he'd sworn to leave behind. "You could have run," Alden said at last, voice low, steady, not accusing but acknowledging. Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was its own confession, its own moral ledger laid bare. Alden stepped closer, searching Caleb's face for anything false, any glimmer of bloodlust or arrogance, but all he found was a man hollowed by duty, by choice, by the desperate need to protect strangers who had no one else left. The sheriff's hand drifted to his holster, not to draw, but to return the gun to its place with a slow, deliberate motion. The click of metal sliding home felt final, like a gavel striking wood. "I ain't arresting you," Alden said quietly, the words cutting through the stillness with the weight of both mercy and truth. Caleb's brow creased, confusion flickering, but Alden held up a hand. "Not tonight. Not after what you did. Not after saving a town that had already laid itself down to die." He gestured toward the boarded windows, the trembling families peering out, the child still clutching Caleb's coat with desperate trust. "If I locked up the only man who still believed they were worth saving." His voice caught in his throat, roughened by emotion he hadn't expected. "I'd be no better than the men lying in this street." The wind carried a faint cry, a child's sob of relief, a mother's whispered prayer, and the sheriff's sighs softened with something like gratitude, something like sorrow. He placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder, firm, steady, the gesture of a lawman recognizing not innocence, but integrity earned the hard way. "You've paid enough tonight," Alden murmured. "More than most men ever will." And in that quiet moment, beneath the bruised sky and the hush of a town rediscovering breath, the judgment was rendered, not by law, not by vengeance, but by the fragile, stubborn hope that still lived in Silent Gulch. The dawn came slow, tender, and almost ashamed to shine its soft gold across the street still scarred by the night. The first rays crept over rooftops like hesitant fingers, brushing the dust, the broken boards, the silent forms of men who would not rise again. And in that fragile, quiet Sheriff Alden found Caleb Rourke standing alone near the edge of town, coat torn, hat low, ribs aching with every breath yet posture steady as a fence post that had survived a storm. Alden approached with the slow tread of a man carrying both gratitude and questions, the cool morning air cutting through the lingering smoke. And for a moment he didn't speak, just stood beside Caleb, watching the sun push its way above the distant ridge, staining the sky with soft amber after a night that had bled red. "What now, Caleb?" Alden asked finally, voice low, not as a sheriff demanding answers, but as a man wanting to understand another man who had stepped so willingly into the fire. Caleb didn't respond right away. His gaze remained fixed on the horizon, where the plains stretched wide and welcoming, a blank page waiting for the next set of footsteps. His shoulders were heavy, weighed down by bruises and memory, but something in the set of his jaw hinted at an unbroken spirit, a quiet resilience carved from the stubborn marrow of men who keep standing even when they're held together by little more than grit and will. When he finally spoke, the words were soft, rough around the edges from exhaustion and something deeper. "Didn't stay to be a hero," he murmured, and Alden felt the honesty of it settle between them like a solemn truth. "Just couldn't walk away." He looked down at his hands, still carrying faint traces of blood and dust. The ghost of the badge Lena had pressed into his palm hours before. He flexed his fingers slowly, as though testing the weight of everything he had done and everything he had lost by doing it. "Ain't much glory in killing," Caleb added. "Even when it's needed. Even when it saves folks." Alden nodded, not in agreement alone, but in understanding so deep it reached the years he'd spent watching good men break and bad men harden. "You gave them back their lives," the sheriff said. "That counts for something." Caleb exhaled, a long tired breath that felt like letting go of part of the night. "Don't know if it counts for enough." Behind them, Silent Gulch was slowly waking, shutters sliding open, mothers stepping into the dawn with trembling relief, children peering out with the tentative wonder of those discovering the world hasn't ended after all. A lantern was extinguished on a porch, a bell rang softly in the small church at the center of town, not in mourning, but in thanksgiving. And yet, Caleb didn't turn to look. He didn't seek their gratitude or their blessings. Instead, he hitched his coat around his shoulders, wincing as bruised ribs protested, and glanced once more at the horizon where the sun now glowed fully, bright, patient, promising a day in which he no longer had to be Silent Gulch's shield. "Town'll be all right now," Caleb said softly, "long as they remember what they're worth." Alden watched as Caleb stepped forward, boots stirring new dust into the golden morning, the rising sun catching on the torn edge of his coat and turning him into a silhouette etched in firelight and resolve. There were no cheers behind him, no songs, no medals, only the quiet reverence of a town awakening to safety. Caleb didn't look back. Not once. Sheriff Alden felt something catch in his throat as he watched the man walk away, not as an outlaw nor a hero, but as a wanderer carrying the weight of every bullet he never had, every life he'd saved, and every line he'd refused to cross. And as Caleb Rourke disappeared into the horizon, the sun climbing higher behind him, Silent Gulch took its first true breath in years, a breath of hope, hard-won and fragile, while the lone cowboy kept riding toward whatever redemption waited beyond the next ridge, a figure marked by dust, bruises, and a heart that refused to run when it mattered most. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.